Here's Mr. Moffman coming at you again with another APGov video. This is our last video taking a look at topic 5.7, groups influencing policy outcomes. Previously we talked about different types of interest groups that exist, and today we're going to be taking a look at some of the ethical dilemmas associated with interest groups historically, particularly with regards to lobbying and attempts to try to reform that. Now, when we talk about lobbying, is the form of trying to directly communicate with members of Congress or other members of government to try to influence policy. Now, there's informal lobbying, and then there are professional lobbyists. The bigger, wealthier interest groups primarily utilize professional lobbyists, those that are literally paid. It's their career to try to work on an interest group's behalf to try to influence members of government. And the kind of the unofficial home for interest groups, like what Wall Street is for the finance sector, you've got K Street. K Street in Washington is the home of most of your major lobbying firms that exist. And, for many, many folks, K Street is kind of the ultimate. This is the major leagues of lobbying. And that's all fine and good, except you have to understand that, where do you get these, lobbyists from? And what kind of activities do they engage in? Are they legitimate? Are they ethical? Are they even legal? Now, when we talk about, many of the scandals associated with lobbying firms and members of Congress, a lot of it has to do with the fact of who they tend to go after in terms of who they try to recruit as lobbyists. It's probably not a big surprise that you see as some of the more, likely candidates tending to be congressional staffers. If you are a congressional staffer, you are someone that has, pretty intimate knowledge of how the legislative system works. You are actively working for a member of Congress. You might be a legislative assistant that helps with, the policy reading, summarizing bills, providing advice on bills, things like that. You know how the wheels turn, you know how things work, you know the relationships, you know the power dynamics, you know all those kinds of things. And that kind of inside knowledge is considered very valuable to interest groups in terms of hiring lobbyists. Remember, lobbyists need access. And if you already have built-in relationships with members of Congress, you've already got half the battle won because you already have those relationships. Now all you need to do is be able to, convince that member of Congress to, vote in line with what your interest group is representing. And note, for many congressional staffers, becoming a professional lobbyist is very attractive because as a staffer, you don't get paid very much. It's a lot of work, minimal pay. You're really a grunt, and that's why, staffers tend to be, folks under the age of 40, because they've got the energy, they're less likely to have families at that age. They are able to commit that kind of time and energy. But note, at some point for many of these staffers, they want to, cash out, if you will. And if you go to K Street and become a lobbyist, there's a good chance that you can, triple your income. You might be going from, making $60,000 a year to $200,000 a year. That's big difference. Now, even more attractive than a congressional staffer, and think about this, staffers have connections, but who has even bigger connections, even more built-in relationships, even more experience? Members of Congress themselves. And so historically, we have seen an attempt by lobbying firms to try to hire former members of Congress themselves who already have the relationships, the experience, all that kind of stuff already built in. And note, if you're a member of Congress, you're getting paid less than $200,000 in terms of salary as well. Now, granted, most members of Congress are, fairly well off to begin with. But note, if a staffer can get $200,000 to be a lobbyist out, right out the gate, think of how many millions of dollars a former member of Congress would get as a paid lobbyist. And this led to a phenomenon that we called the revolving door. The idea being is you leave the Senate, you leave the House, you leave Congress, and all you do is you come right back in now as a lobbyist, meeting with the same people, doing a lot of the same work, but now you're getting paid by a private company to do that. You're not working on behalf of the nation anymore or a particular state or district. Now you are clearly for hire. So these are concerning things. And notes, there is a long, infamous history of scandals associated with these relationships that are all too cozy. If you go back during the Reconstruction era in the 1870s, you had, the Credit Mobilier scandal, which involved railroad interests bribing members of Congress to grant them, lucrative land grant deals to build railroad track across the West, and providing kickbacks, bribes to those members of Congress in return. Much more recently, you had the scandal associated with this gentleman right here. This is Jack Abramoff. Jack Abramoff became, maybe the most, how can I put this? I know I keep using the word infamous, but, he certainly tends to have one of the most negative reputations in the history of lobbying because of his, pretty, egregious, over-the-top, blatant violations of ethics and laws to try to, represent his clients that were interest groups. There's a video we'll be watching in class about the details of what Jack Abramoff did, so I won't go over it here. But suffice to say, the Jack Abramoff scandal of about, 15 years ago is going to start to lead to some creations of reforms in terms of what kind of relationships lobbyists can have with members of Congress. For example, there are pretty strict limits on what kinds of money lobbyists can spend on meetings with members of Congress. In terms of, nowadays you can't give a member of Congress like a trip to a golf resort as a means to set up a meeting place to talk policy. You can't take them out to a fancy steak dinner to talk policy. You can't, buy their son, a member of Congress's son, a brand new car and, use that as an opportunity to talk policy. None of that stuff's legal anymore. We've also seen rules put in place that now have limits, putting together a gap of time that former members of Congress have to adhere to, between leaving Congress and joining an interest group as a registered lobbyist. And right now that is a 2-year gap. So you got to wait 2 years to get back in the game legally. Now that may not seem like much time, but that is more than what it used to be. So understand that when we talk about, lobbying, it is tremendously powerful. It is tremendously lucrative for professional registered lobbyists, but it also comes with some very real ethical problems and dilemmas. Okay? We'll see you next time.